So now that you have been exposed to classic Hollywood's version of motherhood, it's possible for us to move onward to discussing women in horror and the representation of motherhood in horror as well. For Barbara Creed, horror narratives are, like primal fantasies, concerned with origins. Now, probably this essay gave you a little bit of trouble, so I really want to make sure to explain it so that you can understand it more thoroughly. The questions I asked on the quiz were put together with the idea that at least if you had tried to get through it, if you managed to get through some of the basic concepts, you'd be fine. So, like primal fantasies, horror films represent these primal fantasies in terms of the abject. Now, the abject is basically those things that disgust us. So the abject is poop, it's urine, it's blood, it's death, it's dismemberment. It's these things that we are both attracted to and repulsed by. Now we're getting into psychoanalysis here and the work of people like Julia Kristeva and Jacques Lacan. And so they talk about the period before we form our identities as people, before we gain speech, for instance, before we even are able to recognize ourselves in the mirror. This is called the mirror stage, and recognize ourselves as being separate from others. For people like Jacques Lacan, and that's Lacan, if you're interested in looking up his work further, we go from birth, we go through stages of identity development. And part of that identity development is, originally as babies, we don't see ourselves as separate from the mother. We see her as being part of us. There seems to be no differentiation between our body and her body. Okay, so part of the development of ourselves is both learning that we are separate from the mother and repudiating her. That's part of it, as well as being able to recognize ourselves as separate. That's essential as well. And the mirror stage is part of that, when we're able to see ourselves as a whole being. Now, Kristeva argues that this is an ideal. This image in the mirror is an ideal. It's something that isn't real, isn't true, isn't accurate. It's an idealization. But it does allow us to see ourselves as a unified, coherent, separate self. And again, part of that process is pushing the mother away, is seeing the mother as something that is not us, not like us. Okay? So there you see, prior to leaving this realm, the child must create a unified self that is separate from the abject. The mother is part of the abject. The mother represents a lot of that stuff that we see as gross in our culture. And so the horror film, Creed argues, reenacts the confrontation between self and other, or mother, through the construction of the monstrous feminine. That this monstrous female allows us to repel the mother, to see her as something separate from ourselves. So Creed asks, what is the relationship between physical states, bodily wastes, and the horrific, in particular, the monstrous feminine? Sergei Eisenstein, who is a Russian filmmaker, hypothesized that we have a psychophysiological response to film, that we actually feel as well as mentally react to what we see occurring on screen. If you have felt your pulse race, if you have gotten antsy in your seat while watching a film, these suggest that physiological response, that our bodies are actually physically responding to what we see on the screen. So it's causing us mental suspense, it's causing a reaction in our minds, but it's also causing a reaction in our bodies. And so for Creed, she wonders, what is that relationship between our bodies and the bodies on screen? Now, the monstrous feminine is represented by such images as the vagina dentata, that idea of women's vaginas as having teeth. This is an image that's long been drawn upon, this idea of female sexuality as dangerous, whether literally or symbolically. We also get the image of the phallic mother, the mother who has overstated her roles, who takes on a masculine role, basically, that has too much power, has too much authority, and thus is threatening in that way. There's also that idea of, that old penis envy myth of Freud, that idea that women are jealous of men's penises, and therefore men, when they see girls without the penis, supposedly react in horror because they assume that she is castrated. This is part of Freud's theory as well, not just that women have penis envy, but that there's also this fear of castration by boys when they are confronted with the quote-unquote lack of female genitalia. And so these images often pop up in our stories about the monstrous feminine. Women become constructed as an imaginary other that is repressed and controlled in order to maintain borders, boundaries, social order. For Kristeva, whom I mentioned on the last slide, the abject is that which transgresses borders, boundaries, laws, rules, institutions. It's that won't be contained, that resists containment, that is excessive, that is too much, right? And so when we see the corpse on the ground, she says, or when we see the blood pouring out of something, out of a being, when we see vomit, and even when we see curdled milk, she actually uses at the beginning of her text, The Powers of Horror is the name of her book. She actually talks about the image of curdled milk making her vomit when she is forced to drink it. The skim on the top of the milk actually grosses her out and creates this physical sensation and creates vomit, basically, in being confronted with this thing that disgusts her. And so we attempt to control that, but of course the abject resists that control. So I've already mentioned some of this. For Kristeva, the abject is the place where meaning collapses. It threatens life. It has to be excluded in order to maintain our myth of bodily coherence and unity, our sense that we have these borders, these boundaries that can be maintained between ourself and other. So those things that threaten that integrity, that sense of unity and coherence in the self, it has to be excluded. It has to be fenced out. However, that which is abject cannot be fully excluded because it helps to define life. It helps to define our identities, even as it threatens those identities. So even as we're repulsed by those things that threaten us, that threaten law and rules, even as we are repulsed by that, it helps to define us. I am not that thing. I am not that dead thing. I am not that gross thing. I am separate from that. When we put up that wall of I am separate from that, I am not that thing, when we put up that wall, we are attempting to set up a boundary, but it's an illusion. Because that boundary depends, even as we renounce the thing that is disgusting and gross, even as we renounce the abject, it's still helping to define us. If we say, I am not that thing, we are partly being defined by that thing. Again, the abject is represented by such things as blood, vomit, saliva, sweat, tears, corpses, decay. It also includes religious abominations such as sexual immorality and perversion, changes in the body, decay and death, human sacrifice. The things mentioned above, the feminine body, and incest as well are included in the abject. If we have those horrific images of femininity, then of course the female body becomes part of this image of the abject, that which must be excluded. So the abject is a source of horror. It separates the human from the non-human. It separates the fully constituted subject from the partially formed subject. In other words, it separates the coherent, unified self from that which is not that. Rituals often create a moment in which you can have contact with that which is abject and then expel that. So, Mikhail Bakhtin, in his discussion of the grotesque, talks about Mardi Gras, actually, about festivals that enabled the symbolic confrontation with the abject. So lots of celebration of death and decay and body parts, jokes about flatulence and poop and all of that sort of stuff. He talks about those festivals as allowing us to have contact with those things and then expelling them, driving them out, getting rid of them. So in terms of representing the abject in horror films illustrate abjection in three ways. They abound in images of abjection. If you think about that list I gave you earlier, dead bodies, blood, missing body parts, all of that. So those horror films have many, many images, multiple images of abjection. Viewing those horror films signifies a desire for perverse pleasure. And it also signifies a desire to get rid of the abject, to throw it up, to throw it out, to get rid of it, to clean it up, to get it out there. According to Stephen King writes about horror. He says that it's the desire to feed the monster in the basement, basically. He says, because we can't, and this phrase has just stuck with me, so this is a near quote. Because we can't slam our rotten little puke of a sister's hand in the door. In other words, because we're confined by social rule and expectations of politeness and the social contract. Because we can't do that, because we can't do these things that are horrific, we tamp that all down. We tamp all those dangerous impulses down, those unsocial, uncivilized impulses down. Freud talks about this also in Civilization and Its Discontents. He talks about the need to set up social taboos and rules that keep us from being what for Freud were our true selves, murdering people, sleeping with multiple women or men, etc., etc., that we have to tamp all of those impulses down in order to create this, basically the social contract and enforce it. And so we have to force all that down into the repressed. You've probably heard about repression. Well, both Freud and Stephen King and Creed are talking in part about the repression of those elements, the abject, the horrific, the repression of all that, and that horror is a way to let it out, to get rid of those repressed impulses, to clean out the garbage, if you will. in horror, we have a crossing of boundaries as well. So it's got lots of images of abjection. It has these crossing of boundaries. Remember, we said the abject is that which isn't allowed, which crosses boundaries, which breaks rules. So these horror films depend upon an encounter between the symbolic order and that which threatens its stability. In other words, between law and that which threatens law, between our rules of civilization and that which threatens them. There's also the abject through the construction of the maternal figure. Remember that, again, the child forming its identity must repudiate the mother as something that is abject, something that is not me. And so the maternal body becomes the site of conflicting desire. We want to stay with the mother while we also fear losing ourselves in her. We fear because to see ourselves as separate from the mother requires a wrenching away from her. Anything that suggests that disillusion into oneness with the mother, again, that's threatening. Okay. I might just add a little clip, if I can find one right here, of a scene from the X-Files, an episode called Home, which represents that horror in part. That the episode is gross because we learn about this family in which there is a ton of incest, and as a result, in having that incest and in bearing children who are the product of incest, there's a lot of genetic mutilation. And there's tons of images of horror in that episode. And so that's actually a really good example if you watch the episode Home from X-Files. So to explain this a little bit further, this idea of mothers as abject, and again, this is in terms of the field of psychoanalysis. Part of what represents the mother's body as abject, menstrual taboos, excremental taboos, both of these represent ways in which we see the mother's body as abject. Several cultures, when women are menstruating, they separate women from the rest of the society. Now, either they see them as possibly infecting the men, weakening the men, drawing their strength from the men, and that's why they separate them, or they see the women as really powerful during this time, and as a celebration of womanhood, separate the women. So some different reasons for doing that. The maternal body, which includes these elements, the authority of the mother shapes a child's understanding of its body. What is clean, what is unclean, the acceptable and the unacceptable parts, if you will, the ones, what you do and don't say and show in public. Right? Our mothers are, in this theory, the ones who teach us that. And so they create this symbolic mapping on the self. They create this rule of law about the self, about the body. And so the body gets inexplicably entwined with female identity, both because the female is the one who teaches the child about the symbolic aspects of the body, as well as in Western culture, women being made synonymous with the body. That women are often symbolically associated with elements of the body and men with elements of the mind and the role of law. And so this is part of Western culture. This is sort of that patriarchal authority. This is that, you might have heard of the phrase, the law of the father. And this is what Kristeva and Creed are referring to, this idea of men as being associated with language and law and rules, and women as being associated with the body, which is often figured as abject.
Hey, Sheriff, who lives in that house there?
The Peacocks built that farm during the Civil War. Still has no electricity. They grow their own food. They raise their own pigs. They breed their own cows. Raise and breed their own stock. If you get my meaning.
They try to change the way things are. Let them know this is our home. And this is the way it's gonna stay.
Now, I mentioned the simultaneous attraction to and repulsion from, revulsion towards the abject. The abject signifies a split between what we've already talked about as maternal and paternal authority. All right, the maternal, again, being the body, being the rule maker for the body, and men as being the social, the outside world rule maker, the one in charge of institutions and law and order and all of that. So the abject is symbolic of this split between those two authorities. It threatens a subject already constituted as whole and proper. Remember, I said we have to separate ourselves from the abject, that which is not us. But in trying to put that boundary up, we keep the abject as always part of us. The abject, again, is represented also by the mother, that which is not me. Okay? And so the abject represents a fusion with the mother, a time before we had language, again, which is codified as male, is part of patriarchy, as part of the law of the father. So it represents a time before language, a time before we separated from the mother. And so it represents, the abject threatens the fragility of the symbolic order. It brings up all of that past stuff, that time when we were fused with the mother. That time when we didn't understand law and thus weren't worried by it. When law and order and rules were not a part of our compass, our mental compass, if you will. And so there's a simultaneous desire for that and a rejection of it. So in horror, which is a confrontation with the abject, we see an obsession with blood, often with bleeding women, which symbolically represents menstruation. You think of the picture that immediately pops into my head when I think about that is that of Carrie, covered in blood, with the prom. And so this blood in having these bleeding women. Remember earlier I talked about castration anxiety and the idea that the female body represented lack, and that someone, boys fearing girls because of the fear that someone had cut off their penis, had castrated them. And so the female body symbolized as castrated, and as a result, horrific, because it represents the possibility of men becoming castrated. And so that horror villain, that madman, enacts the fear of castration. Okay. So Creed writes that the central ideological project of the popular horror film is purification of the abject through a descent into the foundations of the symbolic construct. So this idea that we descend into the abject, we expel it, and we thus purify. Okay, so the confrontation with the abject is necessary in order to eject it and to reestablish boundaries between human and non-human, between me and what is not me, to separate the symbolic order from that which threatens it, to reestablish law and order, if you will. So, descending into the pit, if you will, and dealing with that horror so that we can shut the door on the pit. Right? Again, Stephen King saying, because we can't slam our rotten little puke of a sister's door, a hand in the door, we therefore create this repression, which we then feed. We have to feed that repression. We have to feed what he calls the alligators in the basement. And by feeding them, by keeping those desires repressed, we have to occasionally step in again to feed the alligators in the basement. We have to engage with the abject, with those uncivilized desires every now and then in order to keep them tamped down, to keep them from exploding, basically, to keep them from escaping the basement. So again, in relation to Creed and Alien, the maternal figure is represented in Alien as it is portrayed in Patriarchy. And so we start off with that primal scene. We start off with the birth from the pods. All right, so the computer being the first quote-unquote mother that we see. She's the treacherous mother. Right? She has instructed them, and she is supporting. She has instructed Ash to get the alien at all costs. Other considerations secondary. So she is the betraying mother. She is the treacherous mother. She is not protecting her children. If we see Kane and Dallas and Ripley, etc., as her children. We also see the devouring vagina, the vagina dentata, that mouth that extends from the alien with the teeth, right? And as I said, it extends from the mouth. It comes out from the mouth almost as if as a phallic symbol. Okay? And so that alien also represents the phallic mother, the powerful mother. We find out in later films that it is female. It's called the Queen. In those later films, the second film is what you heard the clip from at the very beginning of this PowerPoint presentation. Get away from her, you bitch. That's Ripley telling the Queen to get away from the little girl she's trying to protect. So even as Ripley was made mother in this first film, she becomes a symbolic mother as well in Alien 2. So let's talk about that primal scene in a little bit more detail. So in this psychoanalytic paradigm, seeing our parents have sex is one of the first shockers of our lives. That fear, of the female body, of the act of penetration, of the famous question of where do babies come from. So in Alien, we see the archaic mother, the source of all life. It is monstrous because it seems self-sufficient in part. it doesn't depend on the masculine for definition. And this is true both of the computer mother and the alien mother. So in the first primal scene, the crew is quote-unquote born again. They come out of these sterile tubes. They come out, notice the way they're dressed or undressed when they come out of those. And so we have the crew born from the mother, the computer mother, in a sterile environment. If you look at that scene again, you can imagine what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this sterile environment. Notice the bright lights, the white colors, the very clean environment that is there. So that's the first primal scene. The second scene is the entry into the foreign ship, when they land on the planet and go to investigate the signal that they've received. When they enter that foreign ship, I said during the movie, now notice the shape of the ship and of its outside shape, and as they enter into it. And so on the outside of the ship you have the fallopian tubes. It has vaginal openings. It has the womb with the eggs inside of it. And Cain breaking the taboo by peering into the egg, by peering into the mystery, and thus peering into the mother. You might think that we're over-reading by saying these sorts of things, but Geiger, the designer for the film, actually said that this is what he was instructed to do. He was instructed to make these images very much associated with the female body. So it isn't just read. So we mentioned all of these primal scenes, all of these symbolic mothers in Alien. And they are mothers without fathers. They are sterile, powerful mothers. And they represent the archaic mother. And Creed talks about the archaic mother as a voracious maw, right? As an always hungry mouth, yearning to satiate her desire. She writes that the archaic mother is a black hole which signifies female genitalia as a monstrous sign which threatens to give birth to equally horrific offspring, as well as threatening to incorporate everything in its path. This is the generative archaic mother, unquote, that she represents proof of castration, that she is, quote, the all-devouring womb, unquote. And so she's this symbol of monstrosity. The threat, again, of the female body. The threat of the female body, which will also give birth to horrific children. Okay. And this is the female body who can do it herself, who can do it on her own, who does not need a man for definition. And that in itself is horrifying in these films. This horrific, archaic mother threatens to reincorporate, to take back in what she has birthed. So there's this fear of becoming one again with the archaic mother. And there is the desire for non-differentiation, a desire for that state of original oneness with the mother. But at the same time as that there is that desire to meld into the mother, there also is the fear of self-disintegration, of losing oneself, of losing one's sense of identity, of losing one's ego. And so death is simultaneously, this death that she represents is simultaneously beguiling and horrifying. So in Alien, we have a collapse of the archaic and of the phallic mother. The archaic mother, again, this mother who is able to reproduce on her own, who is monstrous in her self-sufficiency, and who is murderous towards her children, and who has this monstrous desire to reincorporate and to destroy life. The alien is the phallic mother, in that it represents this symbolically masculine prerogative, this ability to destroy, to rend, to act as both penis and vagina simultaneously. You've got that, again, that mouth that extends, that is reminiscent both of the vagina dentata and of the penis. And so is threatening. So with the phallic mother, again, you have that threat of the castrated female, but there's something there that allows this female the ability to deny the castration, to disavow the mother's lack of the penis. And so there is some sort of fetish object associated with that. If the fetish object is present, we do not have to accept the threat of castration. We can deny the mother's difference. And so again, to possess that symbolic penis, if you will, is part of the phallic mother. So again, as I've already stated, we have the three different mothers. We have the computer, we have the alien, and then we also have Ripley. So with the computer, we have mother as betrayer. With the alien, we have mother as cannibal. And with Ripley, we have mother as pleasurable sign. We have the mother who represses the nightmare. And so you have the insertion of Jones, the cat, who Ripley then can take care of. Doesn't pay much attention to it until it becomes threatened by the alien, by the phallic mother. And then suddenly by the end is all consumed almost with the desire to protect the cat. So to sum up Creed's reading of Alien, she argues that horror narratives end with the restoration of boundaries. And this is generally true, even though the horror movie might not be completely contained. There might be the hint that the horror will arise again. Although, for instance, in Halloween, it seems like Jason, the horrific figure of Jason, is contained, has been killed. But of course he gets resurrected for umpteen other Halloween films. But there is the restoration of boundaries. There's the restoration of seeming safety, of law, of order, in the perishing of the villain. So that restoration of boundaries enables the abject to go away. Remember, again, the abject is that which threatens order and discipline and the rule of law. And so by the end of the film, all of that's going to be reestablished. So you have this confrontation in Alien. We have a confrontation with and repudiation of the monstrous feminine. So we confront the phallic mother, we confront the horrific mother, the betrayer, and it is repudiated. It is killed. It is blown up. And order is restored, safety is restored. Now, according to Creed, this also reveals a great deal about male desire, including a desire for the collapse of boundaries. But it doesn't tell us about female desire. According to Creed, the archaic mother, whose vast generative womb produces as well as consumes, right? She produces children as well as potentially taking them back into her. The archaic mother is present in, quote, the images of birth, the representations of the primal scene, the taboo fantasy of watching one's parents in the act of procreation, the womb-like imagery, the long winding tunnels leading to inner chambers, the rows of hatching eggs, the body of the mothership, the voice of the life support system, and the birth of the alien, unquote. So that archaic mother represents the all-consuming feminine. I thought bringing in a text by some colleagues of mine in the Southwest Texas Popular Culture American Culture Association, Gallardo and Smith. Jason and Jimena wrote a book just on Alien, and I have a copy if you want to look at it. According to them, in reading Creed, they write, by Creed's reading, the adult alien's teeth and phallic-toothed tongue could both display and conceal the archaic mother's monstrous vagina dentata. The horror in Alien, then, may be read as the fear of the castrated and castrating feminine other, whose monstrous reproductive drive threatens to overrun the human, and therefore must be repressed and controlled, unquote. So that tongue both covers up and shows the vagina dentata. It represents both the fear of castration and the castrator. It represents these seemingly mutually exclusive things, and thus is dangerous. So as we've discussed in the previous weeks, the ways in which we get sewn or sutured into the film through strategies of identification, which we've talked about. Who do we identify with? When? Why? Does it shift? Does it change? So most films are interested in constantly suturing the viewer into place, in making the viewer a part of the filmic world, if you will, forgetting that we're watching a constructed fiction. However, horror undoes this suturing process at moments of abjection. So those strategies of identification we've talked about, the ways in which they get you to identify with characters in the film, those strategies are temporarily broken. The viewer, instead of being rewarded for voyeuristic desire through satisfaction, through getting to peep with pleasure, instead the viewer is punished for that voyeurism. The boundaries that we've discussed so far in this PowerPoint video, the boundaries threaten to collapse. They threaten to disintegrate. And so again, there's that need to rebuild, to reconstitute the boundary between self and screen, to reconstitute the self, which is threatened by disintegration, to rebuild the self, which is threatened by that which is not me, that which is other, that which is gross and disgusting, that which I see with horror. Right? So there's that need to shelf that, to wall that out. Just a side note, an essay I've used in other iterations of this class by Zwinger called Blood Relations. She argues that Alien gives us a mom so gothic she will collude with evil capitalists and aliens in the murder of her children. That the quote-unquote children of the Nostromo are seen as potential portable wombs, that Cain is inseminated by the alien, that horror occurs due to the ambiguous genitalia penetrating his face, neither male nor female, and thus defying a boundary there. And that there is the parody of birth in Cain's gestation and then the birth of the alien from Cain's body. Supposedly the scene of the creature on Cain's face was designed to make, quote, male viewers cross their legs upon seeing it. Again, one of those purposeful moments. We actually do know about director intentionality on this film, and designer intentionality. And then Zwinger discusses the final creature, with the final scene with the creature in which he seems almost attached by umbilical cord, she seems almost attached by umbilical cord to the escape shuttle. She seems to be trying to climb back into the shuttle, aka the womb, when Ripley shoots it out of the shuttle. But then Ripley, of course, fires the engines to blast it out. And of course, we have Ripley attempt to avert the self-destruct sequence, turning the cooling units back on, and Mother refusing, and Ripley responds, "You bitch, goddammit. Mother, I've turned the cooling units back on. Mother!" She says. And so Mother ultimately wins against Ripley in excess of her ostensible functions as a mother.